August 4th, 1943. The 10th day of their private hell. An old, half-rotted barn somewhere in northern Germany, 10 kilometers, about 6 miles, from the Danish border. It smelled of rotting hay, mouse droppings, and fear. The air was heavy, stagnant, like in a crypt. 4 survivors of the 7-man crew of a Lancaster bomber sat in the darkness, looking more like ghosts than men. Flight Lieutenant Arthur Davis, their commander, stared at his hands. The skin, chapped and filthy, was a network of scratches. Black German soil was embedded under his fingernails. With these hands he had held the yoke as their aircraft, their steel home, turned into a fiery coffin. With these hands, just an hour ago, he had strangled a chicken stolen from a nearby farm, clamping its beak shut so it wouldn't make a sound, feeling the small, desperate life flutter, and then go still beneath his fingers. He felt neither guilt nor pity. Hunger had burned everything away, leaving only a cold, ringing void. Nearby, leaning against the wall, sat Sergeant Frank Miller, the flight engineer. The old man, as they called him, though he wasn't even 40. He was methodically, almost meditatively, cleaning his knife on a scrap of his shirt. There was no haste in his movements. There was nothing left in him at all but a primal animal exhaustion. 2 others, Gunner Sam Jones and wireless operator Peter Finch, lay in the hay, curled into balls, trying to conserve what little warmth they had. They weren't sleeping. Sleep brought nightmares. Fire falling from the sky, the faces of German children in the flames of Hamburg, flames they themselves had ignited, and the face of young navigator Jimmy Allen, left behind in the woods 3 days ago, his eyes full of silent reproach. The face of Tommy Evans, the youngest, gasping deliriously in the arms of a German soldier's widow. They had become savages, hunters. Their empire, built on discipline and hope, had collapsed, leaving behind only one law: survive, reach the border, at any cost. But to understand how the elite of the Royal Air Force, the pride of Britain, had turned into a pack of gaunt wolves trapped in a foreign den, we must go back 11 days. To that evening of July 27th, when their world was not yet ash, and the sky above was not an enemy, but a promise. July 27th, 1943. An RAF base in Lincolnshire. The evening air smelled of freshly cut grass, aviation fuel, and anxiety. The sunset painted the sky in soft pastel tones, and this peaceful beauty was a monstrous dissonance with what was to happen in a few hours. The crew of the Lancaster, with the tail code S for sugar, was finishing their final preparations. They were a single organism, a perfectly synchronized machine of 7 men. Flight Lieutenant Arthur Davis, the skipper, seemed a veteran at 28 years old. He had already flown 22 combat missions. He was calm, as always. His calm was not innate, but hard-won, forged in the fires over the Ruhr. He checked the maps, consulted the weather reports, his face an impenetrable mask. But inside, somewhere deep, a small, cold knot of fear tightened before every flight. He was writing a letter to his wife, always the same. "I love you. I'll be back soon. Don't worry." He didn't know that she would receive this letter 6 months later, along with a notice that he was listed as missing in action. Sergeant Frank Miller, the flight engineer, was fussing with the engines, his calloused hands gently stroking the steel skin as if it were a living creature. He knew this machine better than his own wife. He heard every vibration, every foreign sound. He was the heart of the aircraft. Near him, sitting on the grass, was the 20-year-old navigator, Flying Officer James Allen, or just Jimmy. He was the brain of the crew. Talented, bold, an Oxford graduate, he charted their course on the map with mathematical precision, proud of his work. For him, the war was a complex navigational problem, an equation with many unknowns. He did not yet know that soon he would have to plot a course not by the stars, but by the sun and the moss on trees, and the price of an error would not be a reprimand, but his life. The bomb aimer, Sergeant George Williams, nicknamed Big George, smoked in silence, staring at his aircraft. His job was to press a single button. One button that would release 12,000 pounds of death upon the city below. He tried not to think about the homes, the women, the children down there. He thought about numbers, altitude, speed. It was his way of staying sane. Wireless operator Peter Finch and gunner Sam Jones were playing cards, laughing loudly. They were the rowdiest of the crew, their laughter a defense mechanism, a way to chase away the fear. And finally, Sergeant Thomas Evans, Tommy, the tail gunner. He was only 19. This was his 5th mission. He sat in his tiny, isolated turret in the tail of the plane, the most dangerous position. He was their eyes in the back of their head. He still wrote letters to his mum, telling her the food was good and England was very beautiful. He didn't mention the night fighters or the icy terror that gripped him every time tracer rounds appeared in the darkness. That evening in the mess hall, they served bacon and eggs, a tradition before a combat mission. They ate, joked, made plans for their leave. They talked about girls, about football, about the future, about a world of peace that they believed was sure to come. They did not yet know that in a few hours, their world, their plane, their brotherhood, all of it would be torn to pieces in the skies over Germany. A sense of foreboding hung in the air, like the smell of ozone before a storm. The weather forecast promised poor visibility. Intelligence reported that additional anti-aircraft batteries and night fighter squadrons had been moved to the Hamburg area. But an order was an order. Operation Gomorrah had to continue. As they climbed the ladder into their Lancaster, Arthur Davis took one last look at the sunset. It was blood red. He wasn't superstitious, but a chill ran down his spine. He had no idea that the thud he would hear in a few hours would not be an enemy shell against the armor, but the final death rattle of his steel bird. 2,330 hours. The Lancaster S for sugar was at 20,000 feet, entering the airspace of the Third Reich. Below them, the earth was covered by a thick blanket of clouds, black as velvet. But it was a deceptive silence. The crew was at their stations, each a cog in a vast machine. Inside the plane, it was dark and cold. The only sources of light were the dim bulbs on the instrument panel and the ghostly green glow of the screens. The air was filled with the monotonous, lulling drone of the 4 Merlin engines. But sleep was the last thing on their minds. Their bodies were tense to the limit. Their eyes scanned the darkness. Their ears listened for every whisper on the radio. "Approaching the target, Skipper," came the calm voice of Jimmy Allen in their headsets. "ETA is 01255. And then it began. First, the ground below came to life. Dozens of searchlights like the tentacles of a giant octopus clawed at the night sky, searching for prey. Their beams intersected, creating bizarre domes of light in the clouds. Then the flak guns opened up. At first it was distant, muffled pops like fireworks, but with each minute they grew closer and louder. Black flowers of flak began to blossom around the aircraft. Shrapnel drummed against the fuselage like hail on a tin roof. The plane shuddered, dropping into air pockets, but Arthur Davis held the yoke steady, guiding his machine through the fiery storm. "Damn, they're angry tonight," Sam Jones rasped over the intercom from his upper turret. "Target acquired," reported the bomb aimer, Big George. Below, in a break in the clouds, Hamburg appeared. The city was already burning. Previous waves of bombers had done their work. Massive fires merged into a single pulsating inferno. "Bomb bay doors open," Davis commanded. The most tense moment had arrived. The plane had to fly straight and level, making it a perfect target. Seconds stretched into eternity. "Bombs away!" shouted George. The Lancaster jumped slightly, freed from its deadly cargo. The bombs went down into the heart of the fiery hell. It seemed the worst was over. They were turning for home. But it was at that very moment that fate struck its blow. "Fighter! Aft below!" screamed young Tommy Evans from the tail turret into his microphone. His voice was breaking with terror. Arthur Davis threw the plane into a sharp bank, but it was too late. Tracer rounds stitched across the fuselage. There was a deafening screech of metal. The inner starboard engine erupted like a matchstick. Flames greedily latched onto the wing. "Fire! Number 3 engine is on fire!" reported Frank Miller, trying to activate the fire suppression system. But the fire was unstoppable. The plane began to lose altitude. "Bail out! Everybody out!" Davis gave his final order. The words every commander dreaded to say. Chaos. Panic. They clipped on their parachutes in the cramped, smoke-filled space. The bomb aimer, George, went first. Then the wireless operator Peter and gunner Sam. Frank Miller helped Jimmy Allen, who was wounded in the leg, get to the hatch. Arthur Davis was the last to leave the plane. Before he jumped, he cast a farewell glance at the instrument panel. The altimeter showed 8,000 feet and was dropping fast. He stepped into the void. A deafening silence after the roar of the engines, the whistle of wind in his ears. He pulled the ripcord. A sharp jerk, and a white canopy blossomed above him. Below, his Lancaster, engulfed in flames, continued its final deadly dance, hurtling toward the earth. Arthur watched as his home, his fortress, his steel comrade vanished into the darkness. And then came the impact. Hard, painful. He landed in the treetops, branches whipping his face, the parachute lines tangling. He was left hanging 10 feet above the ground, helpless as a marionette. Alone, in the heart of an enemy nation. He looked at his terrified, trembling hands, then at the dark, hostile forest. And in that moment he understood. If they were to survive, he had to become not just their commander, but the leader of the pack, ready for anything. The landing was brutal. Arthur Davis struggled to free himself from the parachute lines and jumped to the ground, twisting his ankle. A sharp pain shot through his leg. He fell to his knees, breathing heavily. He was surrounded by a forest, black, silent, smelling of damp earth and pine needles. In the distance, air raid sirens wailed and dogs barked. He was alone. Utterly alone. The first thought that struck him was of his crew. Were they alive? Where were they? According to procedure, they were to try and regroup at the crash site. But where was it? All he had seen was a fireball plummeting somewhere beyond the trees. Panic, cold and sticky, began to rise in his throat. He forced himself to calm down. Breathe. Think. The first rule of survival, don't panic. He buried his parachute to leave no trace. Then, fighting the pain in his leg, he moved in the direction where he thought the plane had gone down. He walked for about an hour, pushing through thorny bushes, stumbling over tree roots. Finally, he emerged into a small clearing. In its center, the wreckage of his Lancaster was still smoldering. The metal was twisted beyond recognition. Nothing remained of its former majesty. It looked like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast. Around the wreckage, people with lanterns were already bustling about. Germans, soldiers, or locals. Arthur froze behind the trees, barely breathing. His heart was pounding so loudly he thought they would hear it a mile away. He lay in the bushes for several hours until the Germans left. When all was quiet, he cautiously approached the wreckage. He was looking for bodies. He prayed he wouldn't find any, and he didn't. It was the first spark of hope. That meant they had all managed to jump. All of them. Now he had to find them. They had a prearranged signal, an owl's cry. 2 short hoots, and 1 long one. Simple, but effective. Arthur drew a deep breath and let out the signal call. Silence. He repeated it. Silence again. Despair began to creep back in. Maybe they had landed too far away. Maybe they had already been captured. He called out a third time, pouring all his hope into it. And suddenly, from somewhere to his right, came an answer. The same owl's cry. Arthur rushed toward the sound, forgetting his injured leg. A few minutes later, he saw a figure in the darkness. It was Frank Miller. The old man was in one piece save for a deep scratch on his face. They embraced like brothers. "I thought I was alone," Frank whispered. "We're not alone," Arthur replied. Over the next hour, using the signal, they found 3 more. Sam Jones, Peter Finch, and Big George. All were alive, having escaped with only bruises and scrapes. The joy of their reunion was short-lived. It was replaced by a harsh reality. There were 5 of them. But where were the other 2? Jimmy Allen, the navigator, and Tommy Evans, the tail gunner. The brainiest and the youngest. They kept calling, but there was no answer. At dawn, they gave up the search. It was too dangerous to stay put. In the daylight, they could easily be discovered. Arthur made his first command decision on the ground. We move north toward Denmark. We walk only at night. We hide during the day. We speak only in whispers and only in English. No contact with the locals. We are ghosts. We are not here. Everyone silently agreed, but an unspoken question hung in their eyes. What about Jimmy and Tommy? We'll find them, Arthur said firmly, though he didn't believe it himself. Just as they were heading deeper into the forest looking for a place to lie low for the day, Jimmy Allen emerged from the bushes. He was limping, his uniform torn, his face as white as a sheet. It turned out he had injured his leg on landing and couldn't walk fast. 6 were accounted for. Only 1 remained. 19-year-old Tommy. They searched for him the entire next day, risking discovery. But it was in vain. The boy had vanished, dissolved into the German forest. It was then that Jimmy Allen broke for the first time. We should surrender, Arthur, he said. We're hundreds of miles from home. We have no food, no water. My leg. We won't survive this. Shut up, Jimmy, Arthur answered quietly but firmly. We are going home. All of us. But in that moment he felt for the first time that their main enemy was not German patrols or hunger. Their main enemy was despair, which had already begun to sink its poisonous roots into their souls. That night, as they lay in a ravine, huddled together for warmth, they heard the nearby barking of dogs and German voices for the first time. A patrol. They froze, turning to stone. The dogs barked closer and closer. It seemed that in another moment they would be found. Their hearts sank. This was the end. The first few days were the most terrifying. They weren't just enemies on foreign soil. They were disoriented, frightened boys, thrown from their familiar world of altitude and speed into the viscous, primal horror of the forest. Hunger came quickly. At first, it was just an unpleasant, gnawing feeling in the stomach. But by the second day, it had become a dull, aching pain that never let up. Thirst was even worse. Their tongues swelled and stuck to the roofs of their mouths. They tried to drink from puddles, but the water was murky and smelled of slime. Arthur forbade it, fearing dysentery. But the real enemy wasn't the physical torment, but the psychological pressure. During the day, they lay in thick undergrowth, not daring to move. Any snap of a twig, any cry of a bird made them flinch. They listened to every sound, the distant drone of an engine, a dog's bark, voices. Every sound could mean death. At night, they walked. It was a torturously slow journey. They navigated by the North Star, which Jimmy struggled to find in the cloud-covered sky. They stumbled, they fell, their clothes were reduced to rags. Jimmy's legs swelled and hurt more and more. He lagged behind, groaning, begging for a rest. Arthur was ruthless. Keep moving. We can't stop. He knew that any stop was a risk, but he also saw hope dying in Jimmy's eyes, replaced by a growing hatred. On the 3rd day, they faced their first major obstacle, a wide paved road. Military trucks drove along it periodically. Crossing it by day would be suicide. At night, it was also patrolled. They lay in a roadside ditch for almost 24 hours, observing. The hunger and thirst were becoming unbearable. It was then that Frank Miller, the quiet, unassuming flight engineer, proved his worth. He didn't panic. He observed, as if it weren't an enemy road, but a faulty engine that needed fixing. He noticed that the patrol vehicle passed every 2 hours, and that there was a stretch of road where the forest came almost to the edge on both sides. "We need a diversion," he whispered. The idea was simple and brilliant. Big George, the strongest among them, would walk half a mile down the road and throw a large rock into the bushes on the other side as the patrol approached. The noise would attract their attention, force them to stop, and in that moment, the others would have a few precious minutes to run across the road. This was their unexpected weapon, not a rifle, not a grenade, but cunning and a knowledge of human psychology. The plan worked perfectly. The sound of the rock made the patrol break, and the soldiers cautiously shone their flashlights into the bushes. At that moment, 5 shadows darted across the road and disappeared into the forest on the other side. 10 minutes later, George rejoined them. It was their first small victory. It gave them a fragile hope. They had done it. They had outsmarted the enemy. Emboldened by their success, they grew bolder. That same night, they stumbled upon an apple orchard. The apples were still green and sour, but to them, it was a feast for the gods. They ate greedily, choking, unable to stop. For the first time in 3 days, they felt almost human. But this small victory nearly turned into a disaster. Their euphoria made them careless. They didn't notice an elderly German with a rifle emerge from the guardhouse. He wasn't a soldier, just a watchman. He shouted something in German. They scrambled to run. The old man fired into the air. They ran without looking back, fueled by adrenaline and fear. They ran until their lungs burned. When they finally collapsed, exhausted in some ravine, they realized they had made a terrible mistake. Now someone knew they were here. A real hunt would soon begin. After the incident in the apple orchard, their strategy changed. Arthur realized that passive survival relying on luck was a road to nowhere. They needed a system. They needed a base, a place where they could rest, recover, and plan their next moves. Fate, strangely enough, smiled on them. On the 5th day of their journey, they came across an abandoned cabin in the woods. Perhaps it was an old hunting lodge or a forester's hut. It was dilapidated, the roof leaked, but it had walls and a door. It was a fortress, their Noah's Ark in the middle of a hostile world. It was here that Arthur Davis completed his transformation from an aircraft commander to the leader of a primitive tribe. He established the strictest of rules. No one leaves the cabin during the day. No fires, to avoid attracting attention with smoke. All scavenged food and water is turned over to him and divided equally. The penalty for stealing was exile. It was tantamount to a death sentence. He instituted a round-the-clock watch at the single window. Everyone had to stand guard for 2 hours. He turned their refuge into both a prison and a salvation. Frank Miller, their self-taught genius, proved himself again. He repaired the leaky roof with branches and moss. He devised a system for collecting rainwater. Under the hole in the roof, he placed an old rusty basin they found in a corner. This water, filtered through a piece of cloth from a shirt, became their greatest treasure. He even fashioned primitive snares for small animals out of wire and string. Their life settled into a harsh but predictable rhythm. During the day, they slept in shifts or simply lay in silence, lost in their own thoughts. At night, the 2 strongest, Big George and Sam Jones, went out on foraging trips. They were their hunters and gatherers. They brought back wild berries, mushrooms that Frank carefully inspected, and sometimes, if they were lucky, they managed to catch a rabbit or a squirrel in the snares. They ate the meat raw because they couldn't risk a fire. This diet was disgusting, but it gave them strength. Arthur kept a record of everything, every sip of water, every piece of meat. He was their accountant, their dictator, their god, and the system worked. It gave them not only the physical resources to survive, but something more important, psychological stability. They had a purpose, a routine, a sense of community. They were a crew again, only now their aircraft was this old shack, and the enemy was the entire world around them. They even started talking, not about the war, not about the past. They told each other about their families, their dreams, Peter Finch, the wireless operator, turned out to be a wonderful storyteller. He retold the plots of books he had read and films he had seen. He created for them an illusion of another normal world, where you didn't have to eat raw meat and fear every rustle. They lived in that cabin for almost 4 days. It was the calm before the storm. They began to believe they could survive, that their system was flawless. But they forgot that their system rested on one man, and that within their small empire, a rebellion was brewing. The voice of despair, which belonged to the navigator, Jimmy Allen. He hated this system. He hated Arthur. He believed they were just delaying the inevitable, slowly dying in this forest prison. And one evening, as Arthur was dividing a captured rabbit among the 6 of them, Jimmy exploded. The conflict had been brewing for a long time. It hung in the stale air of the cabin like a thundercloud. Jimmy Allen, the brilliant navigator, accustomed to the precision of maps and instruments, could not accept their situation. To his logical mind, their trek was a pointless, suicidal endeavor. Fear and the pain in his wounded leg had broken him. He saw Arthur not as a savior, but as a tyrant leading them all to slaughter for the sake of his stubborn pride. That evening, as Arthur was dividing tiny pieces of raw meat with surgical precision, Jimmy scrambled to his feet, as much as his injured leg would allow. "I can't take this anymore," he shouted, breaking the cardinal rule of speaking only in whispers. "Don't you see what we're doing? We're rotting alive here. Eating carrion, drinking swamp water. For what, Arthur? For your stupid idea of reaching Denmark?" Everyone froze. It was open rebellion. "We are officers of the Royal Air Force, not savages. We should surrender. In a POW camp, they'll feed us, treat us. It's our only chance to survive," he continued, his voice breaking into a hysterical whisper. There was a terrible logic to his words, the logic of despair. Several of the men looked down. The seed of doubt Jimmy had planted was beginning to sprout in their exhausted souls. Arthur slowly rose. He looked Jimmy straight in the eye. There was no anger in his gaze, only an icy, deathly weariness. "You think a warm welcome awaits us, Jimmy?" he asked quietly. "Have you forgotten what we were doing 3 days ago? We were burning their city. To them we are not soldiers. We are terrorists, child killers. Have you seen the leaflets they drop? A reward for every downed airman. They won't take us prisoner, Jimmy. The first mob we meet will lynch us. They'll hang us from the nearest tree." He paused, letting his words sink into the others' minds. "You say we're savages?" "Yes, we are. Because civilization was left behind on the other side of the channel. The laws are different here, and if you want to survive, you will tear meat with your teeth and drink from a puddle. And you will thank God for every new day." He walked right up to Jimmy. "I'm not leading you to your deaths. I am leading you home. But I can't carry those who have already given up. If you want to leave, then leave. The door is open. But if you stay, you will follow my rules. Once and for all." It was that surgical cruelty. He wasn't threatening. He was offering a choice. And that choice was more terrifying than any threat. To walk out alone into the night forest meant certain death. Jimmy stared at him with hatred, but fear was already churning in his eyes. He was broken. He slumped to the floor, covering his face with his hands. The rebellion was crushed. Arthur's authority was restored, but the price was high. Their fragile brotherhood had fractured. They were no longer a single unit. There was them, and there was Jimmy, an outcast in their small tribe. It seemed the internal enemy had been defeated. They could move on. But while they were dealing with their own conflict, they failed to notice their real enemy strike its blow. That same night, Peter Finch, the wireless operator, developed a high fever. He was delirious, his body racked with shivers. The water from the forest stream he had secretly drunk a few days earlier had been tainted. He had dysentery. Now Arthur faced the most terrible choice of his life: to leave a sick comrade to die, or to risk everything to try and save him. Peter Finch's illness progressed rapidly. Within a day, he could no longer stand. He lay in a corner of the cabin, burning with fever, moaning softly. His body was dehydrated. Without medicine and proper medical care, he was doomed. The crew was silent. Everyone understood that a sick comrade was an anchor that would drown them all. They couldn't stay in the cabin forever. Sooner or later, they would be discovered. But they couldn't carry him either. It would slow them to a crawl and make them easy prey. Jimmy Allen, subdued after his failed mutiny, remained silent, but his eyes held a gloating, "I told you so." The others avoided looking at Arthur, unwilling to participate in the monstrous decision that had to be made. All night, Arthur sat beside Peter, moistening his cracked lips with precious rainwater. He remembered Peter in the mess hall back at the base, a cheerful, vibrant lad who told jokes and recounted film plots. Now, all that was left was a withered, suffering shell. To leave him here was not just to condemn him to death, but to betray everything they believed in, to betray their brotherhood. In the morning, Arthur made a decision, the riskiest, most insane one of them all. "We're going to ask for help," he said quietly. Everyone stared at him as if he were mad. "Are you out of your mind, Skipper?" Sam Jones was the first to break the silence. "Who are we going to ask?" "The Germans. They'll shoot us on sight." "Not all Germans are soldiers," Arthur replied. "There are farms, isolated houses. We'll find one, and we'll ask. Not as soldiers, but as human beings." It was a gesture of desperation. The chances of success were negligible, but the alternative was Peter's slow, agonizing death and shame for them all. They found what they were looking for by evening, a small, secluded farm a few miles from their forest hideout. No other houses were visible from there, a perfect spot. They watched the farm until nightfall. They saw only one woman, middle-aged, dressed all in black, a widow. This both increased and decreased their chances. A widow might be bitter at the world, especially at British airmen, or she might show compassion. It was a game of Russian roulette. Arthur decided he and Frank Miller would go. Frank spoke a little German, which might help. The others were to wait in the woods. They approached the house after it was completely dark. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs like a sledgehammer. He knocked on the door. A woman opened it. She was holding a kerosene lamp. The light snatched their gaunt, bearded faces from the darkness. The woman wore a simple black dress. Her face was stern, tired. There was no fear in her eyes, only a bottomless sorrow. "What do you want?" she asked in German. Frank, stumbling over his words, began to explain that they were English, that their comrade was dying, that they needed medicine, water, food. He spoke and the woman watched them in silence. Her gaze was heavy, appraising. When Frank finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she said one word, "Come in." Inside, the house was clean and modest. On the wall hung a photograph of a young German soldier in a frame with a black ribbon. Her husband, killed on the Eastern Front. She motioned them to the table. She placed a pitcher of milk, bread, and cheese on it. They stared at the food like savages but didn't dare touch it. The woman, her name was Ilse, watched them. She had to make a choice. Before her were the enemy, the men who had possibly killed her husband, her brothers, her neighbors. She could simply walk outside and call for help, and she would be hailed as a heroine, avenged. But she didn't see terrorist bombers before her. She saw two desperate, exhausted boys who could have been her sons. She saw in their eyes the same fear and pain she had seen in her husband's last letters. And she made her choice. She brought them boiled water, some kind of fever powders, and an herbal infusion. She spoke not a word of judgment, not a word of hatred, only this: be gone before sunrise. But just as they were about to leave, thanking her for saving them, they heard the sound of an engine outside. Headlights slashed across the window. A military patrol was pulling up to the farm. The sound of the approaching vehicle paralyzed them. For Arthur and Frank, this was the end. They were trapped. There was nowhere to run. They looked at Ilse. For a moment, fear flickered in her eyes, but it was instantly replaced by a cold resolve. She pressed a finger to her lips, urging them to be silent, and pointed to a door leading to the cellar. They dived into the darkness below, holding their breath. There was a loud knock on the door. "Frau Schmidt, open up!" a rough voice called out. Ilse opened the door. On the threshold stood 2 German soldiers with machine guns. One, a Feldwebel, was old and weary. The other was very young, with an insolent expression. "What is it, Herr Feldwebel?" Ilse asked in a calm voice. "Old Hans, the watchman from the orchards, says he saw suspicious men in the area. Looked like downed English airmen. We're searching the area. Have you seen anyone?" the Feldwebel asked, peering into the dark room. In the cellar, Arthur and Frank could barely breathe. They heard every word. Their fate was in the hands of this German woman. She could send them to their deaths with a single word. "No," Ilse answered in a steady voice. "I have been home all day. No one has been here but you." The young soldier grunted in disbelief. "And what's this on your table? Expecting company?" He pointed to the 2 mugs of milk and the untouched bread. Arthur's heart plummeted. It was a fatal mistake. "That is for me," Ilse replied without batting an eye. "I was not feeling well. I have no appetite." The Feldwebel gave her a long, hard look. He saw her mourning dress, the photograph on the wall. He was an old soldier, and knew what grief was. He may have suspected something, but he chose not to interfere. "Very well. If you see anything, report it to the commandant's office immediately. And lock your door. These are troubled times." The soldiers left. The vehicle drove away. The silence that followed seemed deafening. Arthur and Frank climbed out of the cellar. They were shaking. They looked at Ilse with awe. This woman, an enemy, had just saved their lives at the risk of her own. "Thank you," was all Arthur could manage. She gave a silent nod. She gave them a little more food and an old, battered map of the area. "Go north," she said, "through the swamps. The patrols rarely go there. It is about 50 kilometers, roughly 30 miles to the Danish border. After that, God will have to help you." They left without looking back. They returned to their forest cabin as dawn was breaking. Ilse's medicine worked a miracle. A day later, Peter was better. His fever had broken, and he was able to drink and even eat a little. They were saved. But the encounter with Ilse had changed them. It had shattered the simple black and white picture of the world they had in their heads. The enemy had a human face, a face capable of mercy and self-sacrifice. This was a knowledge that both gave them hope and made the war seem even more senseless and terrible. 2 days later, when Peter was able to walk with support from his comrades, they left their cabin and headed north, following the route Ilse had shown them. The journey through the swamps was difficult but safe. They walked for 3 more days. Hunger and exhaustion returned, but now they had a goal. A visible, tangible one. The border. On the 10th day of their journey, they reached a river beyond which, according to the map, lay Denmark. Neutral territory. Freedom. But the river was guarded. There was a watchtower on the bank and a patrol boat moved along the water. Crossing it seemed impossible. Their long, agonizing journey had ended at one last insurmountable obstacle. Salvation was so close, yet so infinitely far. It was then, on the brink of complete despair, that help came from where they least expected it. A man in fisherman's clothes emerged from the coastal reeds. He was a Dane, a member of the local resistance. It turned out Ilse had done more than just give them a map. She had informed her people about the downed airmen. The underground network had been watching over them, protecting them, waiting for the right moment. That night, the Danish fisherman took them across in his boat. 5 exhausted, filthy, bearded ghosts set foot on the soil of freedom. They had made it. They had survived. The euphoria was short-lived. In Denmark, they were not welcomed as heroes, but as a problem. They were handed over to the British consulate. The interrogations began. Endless reports. Their story of a 10-day trek through the heart of the Reich was not believed. They were suspected of collaborating with the enemy. How else could they have survived? Their brotherhood, forged in the skies over Hamburg and the forests of Germany, was destroyed by a soulless bureaucratic machine. They were separated, sent to different units. Their fate was buried in classified archives under the stamp Top Secret. The fates of the surviving crew members of Lancaster S for Sugar unfolded in different ways, but each was indelibly marked by those 10 days. The war did not end for them at the Danish border. It continued inside, in their souls, until the very end of their lives. Flight Lieutenant Arthur Davis, their commander, their steel spine, never returned to combat flying. After months of interrogations and vetting by MI9, the department that dealt with escaped prisoners of war, he was declared psychologically unfit for flight. His detailed report on survival techniques behind enemy lines, which could have saved dozens of other lives, was shelved. The official version stated that the crew was saved by luck and the help of the resistance. Admitting the British officer survived by eating raw meat and stealing food was inconvenient for the image of the Royal Air Force. Arthur was discharged on medical grounds. He returned home to his wife, but he was a different man, quiet, withdrawn, with dead eyes. He never spoke of what had happened, but every night he would wake from nightmares in which he saw, again and again, the face of Ilse, the German widow, and heard the death rattle of young Tommy Evans. He died in 1972 from a heart attack. He was only 57. Sergeant Frank Miller, the brilliant flight engineer, returned to his native Coventry and worked as a mechanic in a small garage for the rest of his life. He too remained silent. When his grandchildren asked him about the war, he would just wave them away and say there was nothing interesting about it. But sometimes when he was alone, he would take a small, yellowed map of the German swamps from an old box and stare at it for a long time. It was his only trophy, his only reminder that he had managed to outsmart death. Navigator Jimmy Allen left the RAF right after the war. The guilt over his weakness, his mutiny, haunted him for the rest of his life. He became a geography teacher at a boys' school. He told them brilliantly about the stars, the continents, the distant lands, but he never told them about his own most important journey, the journey through hell. Big George Williams, Sam Jones, and Peter Finch tried to live normal lives. They married, raised children, worked. But the shadow of the war followed them. Any loud noise made them jump. They couldn't be in small, enclosed spaces. They couldn't stand the sight of raw meat. They were heroes whose deeds no one knew. They were survivors who envied the dead. And what became of those who did not return? The body of 19-year-old tail gunner Tommy Evans was never found. His mother believed until the day she died that her boy was alive and would one day come home. She received the standard notification: missing in action during a combat mission. Only rumors circulated about his fate among the few who knew the truth. Some said that he was found, wounded, by German peasants and handed over to the Gestapo. Others claimed he ended up in a concentration camp, but the truth was buried with him somewhere in the forests of northern Germany. He was buried in an old cemetery in a small English town. But, as the locals told it, on his grave, where a simple wooden cross stood with the inscription, "To a beloved son," there were always fresh wildflowers. No one knew who brought them. The official history of war is a history of great battles, strategic decisions, and triumphant reports. There is no room in it for small, inconvenient tragedies. The story of the crew of Lancaster S for Sugar was exactly that: inconvenient. It did not fit into the heroic narrative. It had too much filth, hunger, fear, and moral ambiguity. So it was simply erased, buried in archives, hidden behind non-disclosure agreements. The surviving heroes became silent keepers of their own truth, a truth no one needed. Their fate was forgotten. But the story did not disappear without a trace. It survived. It became a legend, a soldier's tale whispered to new recruits in flight schools and Mi-9 training camps. They said there was one crew that managed to walk across all of Germany after being shot down over Hamburg. There was a belief among soldiers that the spirit of their commander, who'd created order out of chaos, helped lost airmen find their way home. The story became a myth, losing details, names, dates, but preserving its core, the essence of an unbreakable human will in the face of absolute despair. The legend told of how an enemy could become a savior, and how salvation could turn into betrayal. It was a reminder that the most terrible battle in war is not the battle against an external enemy, but the battle for the right to remain human when everything around you is trying to turn you into a beast. This story is not just a chronicle of survival. It is a parable about how any feat not recorded on paper, not confirmed by an order, does not exist for the grand narrative of history. But it continues to live in memory, in whispers, in legends, becoming something more than just a fact. It becomes a symbol of the thousands of nameless heroes whose stories were too real, too terrible, and too human to make it into the pages of textbooks. They received no medals. No monuments were built for them. Their only reward was a life forever poisoned by the memory of the price they had to pay for it. And perhaps therein lies their tragic greatness. Their story is a reminder that from the ashes of war are born not only winners and losers, but also those who are forever stuck between hell and heaven, between life and death, between memory and oblivion.